The night of February 13th, stretching into the 14th, 1945, the city of Dresden, Germany, or rather, what was left of it. Feldwebel Klaus Richter, 56 years of age, was on his knees on the scalding bitumen of the roof, his old aching lungs burning with the dry, hot air that smelled of ash, molten stone, and something else, something indescribably sweet, sickening, that churned the stomach. Below, where just hours ago had stood Florence on the Elbe, an ocean of fire now raged. Not just a fire, no. He had seen fires. He had seen Ypres burn in 1915, when gas first crept across the fields of Flanders. This was different. This was a firestorm, a man-made hell unleashed from the abyss by the will of men. The wind born in this inferno howled with hurricane force, sucking air, trees, debris, and, so they said, even people into its fiery vortex. It tore at Klaus's clothes, flung hot cinders into his face, and made his eyes stream with tears. Around him, on the small patch of rooftop that hadn't yet collapsed into the building's flaming maw, huddled 3 boys. Not soldiers. Boys. His crew. Kurt, 17, the oldest and most cynical, sat with his head in his hands, rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently. His soot-covered face was white with terror. Gerhard, 16, was trying to bandage a burn on his arm with a scrap of his tunic, but his fingers trembled so violently he couldn't tie a knot. And somewhere down there, in the gaping, smoking void where their pride and their curse, the 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun had fallen, lay Eric and Hans, the youngest, the most proper. Klaus stared at the fiery haze devouring the horizon and tried to breathe. Every breath was torture. He could feel the heat seeping through the soles of his boots, the bitumen melting beneath his knees. Their position, their fortress on the roof of the St. Magdalene orphanage, had become their funeral pyre. And he, an old soldier, a veteran of 2 world wars, had led these children here, to this altar. The order had been clear. Hold the position at all costs, defend the sky over a strategically important railway hub. And they had defended it. They had torn into the night sky with fiery traces until the shells ran out, until the barrel glowed red hot, until the building beneath their feet began to crumble. And now, when it was all over, when the sky was empty and the earth was burning, Klaus Richter asked himself only one question. Not, why did this happen? Not, what for? The answers to those questions had vanished long ago. He asked himself, how did we come to this? How had he, an old Feldwebel who belonged in a quiet village with his grandchildren and a mug of beer, ended up here, on the roof of a burning orphanage with 3 half-mad teenagers, mourning 2 others who had just been consumed by the flames? To understand how an anti-aircraft crew of schoolboys became a group of doomed men trapped atop a crematorium, we must go back just 12 hours. To that cold, gray, and yet unimaginably peaceful February day, when their world had not yet collapsed into a fiery abyss. On the afternoon of February 13th, 1945, a damp, dreary silence reigned on the roof of the St. Magdalene orphanage, broken only by the grumbling of Feldwebel Richter and the gusts of icy wind that swept over the rooftops of Dresden. The city below lived its strange, feverish life of the war's final months. Trams still ran, bakeries issued ersatz bread for ration cards, and women in gray shawls stood in queues, discussing the latest rumors from the front. But it was only a facade, an illusion of peace that was about to shatter into dust. Here, on the 7th floor, that illusion felt especially fragile. The enormous, clumsy body of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, gray-green and deadly, seemed alien against the Baroque spires of the Frauenkirche and the towers of the Zwinger Palace. It was like a predator lying in wait on the roof of a temple. And its priests, its attendants, were 5 boys in oversized Luftwaffe greatcoats, Air Defense Auxiliaries, Flakhelfer. Schoolboys pulled from their desks and put behind cannons because real soldiers had long been fertilizing the fields from Stalingrad to Normandy. Klaus Richter circled the gun with slow, proprietary steps, his boots thudding on the wooden planks laid over the tar roof. He squinted at the low, leaden sky, inhaled the damp, coal-scented air, and dispensed instructions through clenched teeth. "Eric, have you cleaned the rangefinder? If the lenses fog up, we'll be shooting at clouds, not Lancasters." "Hans, why are the shell crates open? The powder will get damp, and your beautiful shell will plop into the Elbe like a dead fish." "Kurt, stop staring at the Fräulein down there. She's not interested. But if you miss the spotter's flash, I'll give you a kick that will send you to Berlin without a plane." The boys worked in silence, out of habit. Fear and youthful bravado had long given way to a weary, monotonous routine. They cleaned the barrel, lubricated the traverse mechanisms, and checked the connection to the command post. For them, this was no longer a game of war. It was a job. A hard, cold, and deadly job. Erich, a skinny, bespectacled boy who had dreamed of becoming an engineer before the war, gently wiped the eyepieces of the rangefinder. To him, the gun wasn't just a weapon. It was a complex, perfect mechanism, and he found a kind of perverse comfort in its steel logic. Gerhard, a sturdy boy from a working-class family, deftly stacked the shells, heavy as suckling pigs, into the ready racks. Hans, the youngest, barely 16, sat a little way off, trying to write in a notebook. A letter to his mother. He wrote that everything was fine, that the food was tolerable, and that Feldwebel Richter, despite his grumbling, was actually a kind man. He didn't write about how his feet froze at night, how his stomach cramped with hunger, or how he sometimes cried for his mother in his sleep. Kurt, tall and lanky, lazily rearranged the sandbags that fortified their position. He was the only one who didn't hide his disgust for the situation. "Idiocy," he muttered under his breath. "Sitting here on the roof of an orphanage, waiting for them to drop a bomb on us. Who needs us? The war is lost. The Russians are already in Silesia, and we're here playing soldier." Klaus heard everything but pretended not to notice. He understood Kurt, but discipline was the only thing keeping these boys from panic, from madness. Discipline and routine. So he kept grumbling, checking, and making them do the seemingly pointless work. Around noon, Sister Agatha, the Mother Superior of the orphanage, came up to the roof. A thin woman with a pale, haggard face and incredibly clear blue eyes. She brought them a large, sooty kettle of what was called soup. Hot, murky water with bits of turnip floating in it. But it was hot food, and the boys fell upon it greedily, burning their lips. "God bless you, my children," Sister Agatha said quietly, looking at them. Klaus removed his cap. "Thank you, sister. How are your little ones?" "They are praying, and they are afraid. Last night one boy, little Fritz, kept screaming that he saw black birds in the sky with fiery eyes." Klaus said nothing. He'd seen those birds too, and he knew they would be back soon. Evening fell. The western sky was painted in dirty, violet-pink hues. The cold intensified. Klaus sent 3 of the boys down to a small room under the roof to get some sleep. He and Hans remained on top. They stood by the parapet, looking at the darkening city. "Herr Feldwebel," Hans asked suddenly, "is it true they don't bomb Dresden because it's too beautiful?" Klaus gave a bitter, mirthless chuckle. "That's a fairy tale, my boy. For bombers, there are no beautiful or ugly cities. There are only targets." He pulled a crumpled cigarette case from his pocket, took out the last cigarette, rolled it between his fingers for a long time, but didn't light it. He saved it. "You know, in the First War at Verdun," he began, but stopped. What could he tell this boy? About the filth of the trenches? The smell of decay? About the screams of men dying on barbed wire? He just waved his hand dismissively. "Go, get some sleep, Hans. I have a feeling it's going to be a long night." Hans nodded and went to the hatch leading down, and Klaus was left alone with the huge, silent gun, and the darkening city. He looked at the spires and roofs, the thin ribbon of the Elbe, the distant lights, and two feelings warred within his soul. The duty of a soldier, commanding him to defend this sky to his last breath, and a deep, almost paternal anxiety for the 5 boys sleeping below, and for the 100 other children sleeping even further down in the cellars of this old house. He did not yet know that in a few hours he would have to choose between his duty and his conscience, and that any choice he made would be monstrous. At 9 o'clock that evening, the city opera was performing Der Freischütz. At 10:13, the sirens began to wail over Dresden. The first sound was a low, almost subsonic vibration that came not through the ears, but through the soles of his boots, through the wooden decking of the roof, making his whole body tremble. Only a moment later did it become a piercing, rising wail that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. The siren. It didn't wail. It screamed, like a woman who had seen something unimaginably horrible. Klaus Richter flinched, not from fear, but from habit. That sound had been wired into his nervous system over years of war. It meant only one thing: work. All hands, to the gun! His voice, ragged and hoarse, thundered across the roof, drowning out the sirens. The boys, who had been sleeping in a heap in the room below, shot out of the hatch like scalded cats. Drowsy, terrified, they fumbled with their greatcoats and pulled on their helmets, their faces pale and bewildered in the dim light of an emergency lamp. But their bodies remembered. Muscles drilled to the point of automation were already doing their job. Kurt and Gerhard to the traverse mechanisms, Eric to the rangefinder, Hans to the ammunition. Klaus, like the conductor of this deadly orchestra, took his place at the gun's breech. Within seconds, the crew was ready. 5 figures, frozen by their steel idol, listening to the night. The sirens cut off as suddenly as they had begun, and silence fell. A ringing, dense, heavy silence. A silence that was more terrifying than any scream. In that silence, only a distant, growing drone could be heard. Uneven, multi-toned, as if a giant swarm of bees were flying over the city. Target spotted, sector northeast. Altitude, 4,000, Eric yelled, pressing his eyes to the rangefinder. Klaus raised his binoculars. In the gaps between clouds, illuminated by searchlight beams that swept the sky like the fingers of a blind giant, he saw them. Black, cross-shaped silhouettes, slow, inexorable, like fate itself. Lancasters. Hundreds of them. There were too many to count. They came in waves, stretching across the entire horizon. "Target lead bomber, have you got the data?" Klaus barked. "Got it! Lid 12, altitude 3900, Eric reported. "Traverse," Klaus commanded. Kurt and Gerhard gripped the hand wheels. The barrel of the 88mm gun, long and elegant like the neck of a predatory bird, smoothly crept upward, turning to the northeast. "On target," Kurt shouted. Hans was already at the bridge, a heavy 30-centimeter shell in his hands. His face was focused, his lips pressed tight. At that moment, he wasn't a 16-year-old boy. He was part of a machine. "Load," Klaus ordered. With an effort, Hans rammed the shell into the warm, powder-scented belly of the gun. The metallic clang of the breech block sounded like the cocking of a giant pistol's hammer. "Gun ready," he reported. Klaus paused for a second, pressing his palm against the gun's steel body. He could feel its tension, its readiness to spew death. He looked at the boys, at their tense backs, their clenched jaws, and he whispered, "God be with us." Then he yelled with all the power of his lungs, "Fire!" Impact. The world exploded in sound and light. The roar of the shot was so deafening it felt as if his eardrums had burst. A blinding sheaf of flame erupted from the barrel, momentarily illuminating their faces and sending shadows on the roof scattering and dancing. The hot shell casing ejected with a clang, and a wave of superheated air slammed into his chest. The shell, invisible but felt by his entire body, tore into the night sky, leaving a faint tracer trail behind it. They watched, holding their breath. A few seconds later, far away in the sky near the lead bomber, a small orange flower blossomed. Shrapnel. "Short!" Eric screamed. "Correct! Up 100! Up 100! Gerhard echoed. "Load! Fire!" Another impact, another roar, and again. They fell into a rhythm, a lethal, deafening dance. Load, aim, fire, eject casing, load, aim, fire. They were no longer human. They were a mechanism, one with their gun. And for a moment, it even felt like they were winning. Around them, the city's other flak batteries had also come to life, and the sky was crisscrossed with fiery trails and the flashes of bursting shells. One of the Lancasters suddenly dipped its nose, a black plume of smoke trailing from its wing, and it began to spiral toward the earth, breaking apart as it fell. A triumphant, boyish cheer erupted from the roof, but their joy was premature, because at that moment the bombers opened their bays, and death rained down on the city. At first it was just little lights, like Christmas garlands. Markers, Klaus realized. Flares dropped by the Pathfinders to mark targets for the main wave. And then the real hell began. A low, rising whistle that froze the blood in their veins turned into a deafening roar, and the earth shook. Very close, maybe a block away, a giant pillar of fire and smoke shot into the sky. Then another, and another. High explosive bombs. They ripped the ancient buildings to shreds, turning them into piles of burning rubble. The shockwave reached their roof, making it shudder violently. The boys staggered but kept their feet. "Continue firing!" Klaus bellowed, his voice straining to be heard over the explosions. "Don't look down! Your target is in the sky!" They fired. Furiously, desperately, senselessly. They were like ants trying to bite a giant's boot. They might shoot down 1, 2, even 10 planes, but there were hundreds, and they were methodically, coldly turning Dresden into ruins. Klaus saw the spire of a church collapse, saw the opera house go up in flames like a matchbox. He saw the streets he knew and loved turning into rivers of fire, and at that moment he realized something terrible. This was not just a bombing raid. It was an annihilation, the execution of an entire city. And they, with their small gun, were not defenders. They were merely witnesses. Helpless witnesses to the apocalypse. The salvos of the first bombing wave ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The drone of engines faded to the east, leaving behind a blazing, agonizing city and a ringing silence. But this was not the silence that had preceded the raid. This one was filled with other sounds. The crackle of burning beams, distant screams, the roar of spreading fires, and a strange, low howl, like the moan of a wounded beast. It was the wind, being born in the fiery heart of the city. On the orphanage roof, the crew stood frozen, deafened, and stunned. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe. The boys' faces, lit by a sinister crimson glow, were covered in soot, their wide eyes fixed in horror. They stared down at the handiwork of their enemies, unable to believe what they were seeing. Dresden was burning. Not just individual houses, but entire city blocks. Fire leapt from roof to roof, consuming everything in its path. Are they gone?" Hans asked, his voice trembling, still clutching another shell in his hands. "That was only the first wave," Klaus answered hoarsely, coughing. "There will be a second. Incendiaries." He knew the tactics of these night raids. First, high explosives to rip open roofs, shatter windows, and destroy water mains. Then, incendiary bombs to burn what was left to the ground. He looked at his gun. The barrel was smoking, surrounded by dozens of hot, powder-scented casings. The boys were exhausted. Their hands trembled from the strain, their faces were slick with sweat despite the freezing cold. The adrenaline of battle had faded, leaving only emptiness and a cloying fear. "Check the gun. Resupply ammunition. Now!" Klaus commanded, trying to jolt them back to reality with his officer's voice. But his words sounded hollow even to himself. What was the point? What could they do against this armada? And then Kurt, who had been silently staring at the burning city, broke. "What's the point?" he screamed, tearing the helmet from his head and hurling it to the floor. "Did you see what they've done? They're wiping us off the face of the earth. And we're sitting here with this damn cannon like bait. They see our muzzle flashes and fly straight for us, straight for this building." "Silence, Kurt," Klaus cut him off sharply. "You are a soldier, and you have your orders." "I'm not a soldier," Kurt shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'm a schoolboy. I want to live. And below us, there are children. Orphans. We're drawing the fire right onto their heads." His words, like poison, seeped into the minds of the others. Gerhard lowered his eyes. Hans stood frozen, his mouth agape. Even Erich, always so calm and focused, looked anxiously at the Feldwebel. At that moment, the hatch to the roof creaked open and Sister Agatha emerged, coughing from the smoke. Her face was smudged with soot, her wimple askew. "Herr Feldwebel," she choked out, clutching her chest. "We have a fire! A bomb hit the west wing. It's burning. The children are in the basement. They're choking on the smoke. We need help. Please help us." Klaus looked at the nun's haggard face, then at the terrified faces of his boys, then at the burning city. And his world, the world of a simple soldier where everything was clear. Here is the enemy. Here is the order. Here is my duty. Cracked. It split in two. On one side was the command from high authority. Hold the position, engage the enemy. Do not give in to panic. Disobeying an order in wartime was desertion. A firing squad. On the other side were the cries of children suffocating in smoke and the plea in the eyes of this holy woman, and his own conscience which screamed that he, an old soldier, should be protecting the weak, not using them as a human shield. He stood in the middle of this chasm, the ground giving way beneath his feet. "We cannot leave our post, sister," he said numbly, the words scratching his throat like broken glass. "We are a combat crew. Our place is here." "But don't you hear her?" Kurt exploded again. "She's asking for help. Children are dying down there." "An order is an order," Klaus barked, but the old certainty was gone from his voice. And then the sirens wailed again. This time, their cry was different. Intermittent, ragged, filled with a kind of manic, vicious glee. It was the signal for the second wave. "They're coming back," Erich whispered, looking at the sky. "They're flying lower." Klaus looked at Sister Agatha. Her eyes held not a plea but a verdict. She stared at him in silence, and in her gaze he read everything. His powerlessness and his shame. He had to make a decision. Immediately. And he made one. "Erich, Gerhard, with me. Move. To the water tank. Buckets. Sand. Anything you can find. Kurt, Hans, you stay with the gun. Watch the sky. Do not open fire without my command. Move." It was madness. A compromise that could save no one. He was trying to sit on two chairs that were already on fire. He was splitting his tiny unit in half, weakening both the defense and the rescue effort. But it was the only thing he could think of at that moment. He was trying to be both a soldier and a man. He didn't yet know that in this hell, that was impossible. He hadn't even reached the corner of the roof where the tank of industrial water stood when the sky above them once again turned black with planes. And a rain of fire began to fall on the burning city. The sky shattered into thousands of fiery droplets. These were not bombs in the usual sense. They were small, light cylinders that fell not with a whistle, but with a quiet, sinister rustle, like dry leaves. They fell by the thousands, tens of thousands, covering roofs, streets, and squares like a devil's snowfall. And where they landed, a bright white fire erupted, a fire that could not be extinguished with water. Thermite. Phosphorus. A cocktail from hell, mixed in laboratories and dropped from the heavens. Several of these fire sticks landed directly on their roof. The bitumen instantly ignited, releasing clouds of acrid black smoke. The wooden decking under the gun crackled and caught fire with a cheerful, bright flame. "Put it out," Klaus roared, his voice lost in the growing roar of the blaze. "Cover it with sand!" He, Eric, and Gerhard, armed with shovels and buckets they had filled with icy water from the tank, threw themselves into the fight against the fire. It was a hopeless battle. They would extinguish it in one spot, only for it to erupt in 3 others. The heat was unbearable, searing their eyebrows and eyelashes, making the skin on their faces crack. The smoke stung their eyes and clogged their lungs, causing racking coughs. They worked in a frenzy, in a desperate animal instinct to save their small island in the middle of a fiery ocean. And in this chaos, an unexpected weapon emerged, one not written about in military manuals. Not steel, not gunpowder, but knowledge. Eric, the boy engineer who built radios in peacetime, suddenly screamed, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "Feldwebel, water won't work. It'll only make it worse. We need sand. And we need to create a fire break." Klaus froze for a moment, then understood. The magnesium in the incendiary mix only burned more intensely when it came into contact with water. This bespectacled boy, who had probably never been in a fight in his life, was thinking more clearly in the epicenter of the apocalypse than he, the old warrior. His mind, accustomed to the logic of formulas rather than the chaos of battle, had found the only correct solution. "Do what he says," Klaus barked at Gerhard. "Get the sandbags. Tear up the decking. Make a clearing." They began to work with a new, focused fury. They were no longer just fighting the fire. They were trying to contain it. Gerhard, using a shovel as a lever, ripped up the burning planks with a loud crack, creating a non-flammable strip around the gun. Klaus and Eric dragged the heavy sandbags from the parapet and smothered the most dangerous hotspots. It was work at the absolute limit of human strength. Their muscles burned, their lungs felt ready to burst, and black spots danced before their eyes. But they worked, and they succeeded. At the cost of incredible effort, they managed to cut off the fire, preventing it from reaching the ammunition crates. Their small outpost was saved. It was their first victory. A tiny local victory, meaningless in the scale of the burning city, but no less important for it. It gave them back a sense of control. It proved to them that they could still fight. They stood, panting, leaning on their shovels, and looked at their creation. The gun, surrounded by a black, scorched ring, looked like an altar they had protected from desecration. But their triumph was short-lived, because at that moment, from the depths of the building below, came a sound that made Klaus's blood run cold. It was not a scream of terror. It was a choral, multi-voiced, high-pitched singing. Children singing. They were singing a psalm, quietly, fearfully, but in unison. Sister Agatha was making them sing to drown out the sound of the bombing, to calm their panic. And that thin, pure sound, rising from a burning, smoke-filled basement, was more terrifying than any scream. It was proof that their small victory on the roof meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because while they were saving their cannon, children were being burned alive below. The realization hit Klaus harder than any shockwave. He stood in the middle of the scorched roof, listening to the angelic singing rising from hell, and felt like the lowest of scum. His entire life, all his notions of honor, duty, and a soldier's valor, crumbled to dust. What were all his iron crosses from Verdun worth if now he, an old soldier, couldn't save children? He looked at his boys. Gerhard and Erich heard the singing too. They stood with their heads bowed, their shoulders shaking, whether from exhaustion or silent sobs it was impossible to tell. Then he turned his gaze to the gun, where Kurt and Hans remained. They heard it all too. Hans was crouched down, covering his ears with his hands, shaking his head. But Kurt was standing. He stood straight, his back rigid, and stared at Klaus. And in his eyes, there was no longer fear or hysteria, only a cold, ringing hatred and contempt. And in that moment, Klaus Richter broke. The soldier in him died. All that was left was an old man with the lives of 100 children on his conscience. He made a new decision, a final one. No compromises. "Enough," he said, quietly, but so that everyone could hear. "As of this moment, there are no more orders." The boys looked up at him, unable to believe their ears. "Kurt, Hans," he continued, "get the fire extinguishers and crowbars. You're going down. Find Sister Agatha. Your job is to break through to the emergency exit in the east wing. It should lead to the courtyard. Get the children out. All of them you can. Eric, you're the best technician. Get to the basement. Find the electrical panel. Shut off the power to the entire building if it's still on. Turn off the main gas valve, otherwise we'll all be blown to kingdom come. Gerhard, you're the strongest. You stay with me. We'll hold the line here. We'll keep the fire on the roof from breaking through. Keep it from collapsing until you get the children out. It's our only chance." He spoke calmly, clearly, as if giving orders during a drill. But this was no longer a military operation. This was an operation to save souls. First and foremost, his own. The boys stared at him in amazement. Kurt, who just half an hour ago had been on the verge of mutiny, now looked at the Feldwebel with something akin to respect. He simply nodded, grabbed a crowbar, and was the first to dive into the hatch. Hans followed him. Eric, after a moment's hesitation, also disappeared into the darkness of the stairwell. Klaus and Gerhard were left alone on the roof. They had created their own small, desperate empire, their own order amidst the universal chaos. They had a hierarchy, a clear division of roles, a common goal. This was no longer about defending the fatherland. It was about defending an orphanage, their fortress, their Noah's Ark. They got back to work. They hauled water, beat back flames that licked up from under the eaves, and threw smoldering beams over the side. Gerhard worked like 3 men, his powerful muscles bulging under his tunic. Klaus, despite his age and bad back, kept pace. He felt a strange, bitter satisfaction. He was no longer a cog in the war machine. He was a man doing what had to be done. And in that, there was meaning. They created their own world on that roof, with its own laws and its own morality. And for a time, it seemed they might win. That their small, selfless order could prove stronger than the great, destructive chaos outside. They didn't even notice when the bombing stopped. The second wave of planes had gone, their work done. Now, the city was destroying itself. The firestorm, having reached its full strength, howled and roared, consuming street after street. Their orphanage was still holding out like a rock in a sea of fire. But for how long? Klaus didn't know. He only knew that they would fight to the end. For every meter of this roof. For every child's life below. He looked at Gerhard, who was black with soot and barely standing from exhaustion, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Hold on, son. They'll get the children out soon. We just need to hold on a little longer." Gerhard nodded and tried to smile, but it came out as a pained, weary grimace. Their lives, their world, had shrunk to this patch of rooftop. But even in this tiny, besieged world they had built from desperation and duty, the seed of a new, even more terrible conflict was already sprouting. Because war never lets its soldiers go that easily. They held out for nearly an hour that felt like an eternity. In that time, the roof beneath their feet turned into a searing, hot griddle. The heat, rising from the burning floors below, was so intense that the soles of their boots began to smoke. The sky above was red as a forge, and black flakes of ash drifted down like a mournful snow. Klaus and Gerhard hardly spoke. They moved as a single unit, understanding each other without words. They were no longer trying to extinguish the fire. They were merely containing it, preventing the flames from breaking through to the roof and consuming their last line of defense. Several times Hans appeared from the hatch, filthy, his eyes wild with terror. He brought them water and shouted fragments of information. Smoke. So much smoke. Kurt is breaking through a wall. Sister Agatha is with the children. They're singing. And then he would vanish back into the fiery underworld. Klaus knew their time was running out. The building was doomed. The only question was whether they could get the children out before it collapsed. And it was then, when the tension was at its breaking point, that it happened. Hans appeared from the hatch again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, scrambling up the red-hot ladder, was Kurt. His face was contorted with fury. "Feldwebel!" he screamed, barely making it onto the roof. "It's blocked!" The main beam in the corridor collapsed. "We can't get through. We're trapped." Klaus felt an icy cold grip his heart. What about the emergency exit? "Buried under burning rubble!" Kurt spat. "That's it! It's over! We're all gonna burn in here! The children too!" "Don't you dare say that," Gerhard roared, raising a shovel at Kurt. Klaus stopped him. "Both of you, calm down. Panic won't help us. There has to be another way out." "There is no other way," Kurt screamed, his voice cracking into a falsetto. "I've checked everywhere. The walls are stone, old masonry. We can't break through them. Our only chance is if someone sees us." "If they send help from outside?" "What help, you idiot?" Gerhard couldn't hold back. "Look around. The whole city is on fire. No one is coming for us." "They will. If we give them a signal," Kurt persisted. He ran to the gun which stood in the middle of the roof like a forgotten idol. "This is our signal. We have to fire. Up. Just straight up. So they see us. So someone knows there are still living people here." Klaus stared at him as if he were insane. "Are you out of your mind? Fire? With what? All we have left are armor-piercing rounds. And fire where? Into an empty sky? Yes, into the sky. At the planes. They might come back. We have to make them come back. We have to show them we're here. Maybe then." He didn't finish. Everyone understood what he meant. His mad, desperate logic was monstrous. He was proposing to turn the roof into a target again, to draw the bombers' fire, in the hope that another explosion might perhaps breach a wall and give them a way out, or that some rescue teams, if any even existed in this hell, would spot them. It was the plan of a suicide, the plan of a man pushed to the very edge. "No," Klaus said firmly. "We will not fire. We will not risk taking another hit. We will find another way." "There is no other way," Kurt shouted. He lunged for the ammunition crates, pulled out a heavy, gleaming shell and tried to jam it into the breach. "You just want to die here quietly like rats. I want to fight." Gerhard threw himself at him, trying to pull him away from the gun. They grappled in a furious, absurd struggle right on the edge of the fiery abyss. Hans watched them, crying with helplessness. Klaus had to use force. He, an old man, separated the two fighting teenagers. He struck Kurt across the face, not hard, but enough to sober him up. "Get a grip on yourself, soldier," he snarled. Kurt staggered, blood trickling from his split lip. He looked at Klaus and the fury in his eyes was gone. There was only a bottomless black despair. "We're all going to die," he whispered. The inner enemy, the enemy named Panic, had been defeated. But the price of this victory was too high. They had lost precious time. And while they fought each other, their true enemy, the fire, delivered its final blow. From below came a deafening crack, as if the spine of a giant beast was breaking. The entire building shuddered, and a huge fissure, black as lightning, split across the roof, directly beneath the heavy base of the anti-aircraft gun. The crack was so loud that for a moment it drowned out even the roar of the firestorm. The roof beneath their feet sagged, tilting like the deck of a sinking ship. The boys cried out in terror. Gerhard fell to his knees, nearly sliding into the fiery chasm. Klaus grabbed the red-hot barrel of the gun to keep his balance. Their small world, their fortress, was crumbling. A massive support beam consumed by the fire had finally given way. "Back! Everyone back to the hatch!" Klaus roared, trying to be heard over the groan of the collapsing building. They scrambled backwards, stumbling toward their only escape route. The enormous multi-ton cannon began to tilt slowly, inch by inch, into the chasm. Its base scraped against the concrete, throwing sparks. It seemed that in another moment it would plummet down, crashing through every floor to the very basement where the children were hiding, burying them all under tons of incandescent metal. But it stopped, jammed at an impossible angle. One of its outriggers caught on the edge of the break. It was a final, desperate reprieve granted to them by fate. They huddled by the hatch, staring at the monstrous sight. And in that moment, Klaus Richter made the most important decision of his life. A decision that nullified every order, every regulation, his entire past life. "That's it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "The battle is over. The order is to survive. Kurt, Hans, you go down first. Get the children. All of them. Lead them through the collapsed section. Tear it apart with your bare hands if you have to. Gerhard, you go with them. You'll help. I'll cover you." "And you, Herr Feldwebel," Hans whispered. "I will be the last to leave," Klaus replied. "A captain goes down with his ship." He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. He knew that if they all left the roof, the fire would finally break through, and the collapse would accelerate. Someone had to stay and hold it back until the very end. And that someone was him. This was his duty. Not as a soldier, but as a man. The boys looked at him in silence. They understood everything. Kurt, the rebel of just a few minutes ago, walked up to him and gave him a clumsy, boyish hug. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Go, son. Save them," Klaus replied, ruffling his hair. And they began to descend. One by one they disappeared into the black, smoking opening of the hatch. Klaus was left alone on the roof. Or rather, there were two of them. He and his gun, which clung to life like a wounded beast. He picked up his shovel and went toward the fire again. But his strength was gone. The world was swimming before his eyes. He knew this was the end. But he was calm. He had done everything he could. He had atoned for his guilt. And then he heard a new sound. Not the crackle of fire, not the rumble of collapsing floors. It was the steady, predatory drone of an aircraft engine. Very close. He raised his head. From behind the clouds of black smoke flying straight at him, a twin-engine plane emerged. A Mosquito. A British high-speed bomber. A hunter. He was probably finishing off any remaining targets, or maybe just photographing the results of the raid. The pilot must have seen the huge anti-aircraft gun tilted on the roof of a burning building. A perfect target. The plane was coming in low, straight for him. Klaus could see its glass canopy, the silhouette of the pilot. He wasn't even afraid. He just watched with weary eyes as death approached. He had made his choice. And then, like a jack-in-the-box, Eric shot out of the hatch. His glasses were cracked, his face covered in blood and soot. "Feldwebel! He sees us! He's coming for us!" And right behind him was Hans. "We can't leave him!" he shouted. What were they doing here? Why hadn't they gone with the others? But there was no time for questions. "To the gun!" Eric yelled. It was pure madness. The gun was teetering on the edge of an abyss, tilted at an impossible angle. Firing it was impossible. It was suicide. "It won't hold!" Klaus screamed. "It will!" Eric yelled, already scrambling up the slanted gun mount toward the traverse mechanisms. "The angle is almost right. Hans, help me with the horizontal." "We only need to turn it a few degrees." Without a second thought, Hans rushed to join him. Together they threw their weight against the handwheel, which turned with a hideous screech, trying to aim the multi-ton machine at the plane bearing down on them. Klaus watched them, his heart torn between terror and pride. These children. These insane, heroic children. He lunged for a crate of shells, grabbed the last armor-piercing round. "On target!" Eric screamed. The plane was almost on top of them. Klaus could see the flashes of its cannons. Bullets began to chip at the roof around them. With his last ounce of strength, he rammed the shell into the breach, slammed the block shut, and screamed, "Fire!" Eric, hanging from the mechanism, pulled the firing lever. The gunshot and the collapse merged into a single, deafening, final chord of the apocalypse. The recoil, unabsorbed by the damaged gun mount, was the last straw. The metal holding the gun in place snapped with a monstrous shriek, and the entire 88mm machine, after spitting its last fiery greeting into the face of the enemy, plunged into the fiery abyss, taking Eric and Hans, who never had time to let go of the handwheels, with it. Their screams were swallowed by the roar. Klaus was thrown backward by the blast wave and debris, landing right next to the hatch. He hit his head on the parapet and lost consciousness for a moment. Their shell had passed just meters from the Mosquito. The pilot, stunned by the sudden shot from the burning ruins, instinctively yanked back on his controls. His bombs went wide, hitting an adjacent, already destroyed building. The plane dipped its wings and vanished into the smoke. Their final suicidal attack had saved the orphanage from a direct hit, but the cost of that salvation was unthinkable. When Klaus came to, there was no one left on the roof. Only a gaping, smoking hole where his two boys had just been, and the howl of the wind in his ears. He didn't remember climbing down. His body moved on autopilot. He scrambled down the red-hot rungs, navigated smoke-filled corridors, and climbed over burning beams. Down below, in the half-demolished entrance hall, he found the others. Kurt and Gerhard, using crowbars in their bare hands, were clearing the rubble that blocked the way to the courtyard. Beside them, huddled in a frightened group, stood about 20 children, ranging from 5 to 12 years old. Their faces were smeared with soot, their clothes were smoldering, but they were alive. Sister Agatha stood over them like a mother hen, her arms outstretched, whispering quietly. Seeing Klaus, Kurt rushed to him. "Where is Eric?" "Where is Hans?" Klaus said nothing. He just looked at him and Kurt understood. He turned away and attacked the rubble with a new animalistic fury. A few minutes later they broke through, creating a narrow passage. One by one they began to climb out into the courtyard, and from there, onto the street. If what surrounded them could still be called a street, it was a landscape from Dante's Inferno. The houses around them were smoldering, toothless husks. The pavement was buried under debris. The air was so hot it burned the lungs. In some places the asphalt had melted and flowed like a black river. And everywhere there were bodies. Their small group, an old Feldwebel, 2 teenage soldiers, a nun, and 24 orphans, was an island of life in a dead city. They were no longer a military unit or the residents of an orphanage. They were a family, a strange, broken family of survivors born in fire. Sister Agatha took the smallest boy into her arms. The other children clung to her habit and to the greatcoats of Kurt and Gerhard. Klaus walked ahead, showing the way. He didn't know where they were going. He just walked east, away from the central inferno toward the Elbe. He thought the air would be cleaner there by the water. They walked in silence, stumbling over rubble, trying not to look down at their feet. All around them wandered ghosts just like them. People with burned faces in scorched clothes with empty, unseeing eyes. No one screamed. No one called for help. The city was in a state of shock. Their small personal act of heroism, the sacrifice of Eric and Hans, the rescue of the children. It was all drowned in the scale of the greater catastrophe. No one saw their final shot. No one would ever know that these boys, these Flakhelfer, had defended not only the sky but also the children under their roof until the very end. They simply dissolved into the crowd of refugees, into the chaos of a destroyed city, a small band that had escaped a private hell, only to enter a public one. Their rescue was just the beginning of a long journey to nowhere. They walked through the dying city for hours. Time had lost all meaning. Whether it was still night or morning had come was impossible to tell. The sky was shrouded in a thick pall of smoke, through which only the crimson glow of the fires could be seen. Their strange procession moved slowly, like a funeral march. Klaus, Kurt, and Gerhard carried the smallest and weakest children in their arms. Sister Agatha, barely able to stand herself, supported the older ones, quietly reciting prayers. They saw things the human mind refused to accept. They saw people frozen in the poses in which death had found them. They saw melted trams, twisted into surreal sculptures. They heard the crack of collapsing buildings and the howl of the fire wind. But it was all as if in a fog, behind a veil of shock and extreme physical exhaustion. Their world had shrunk to a single task: put one foot in front of the other. Walk. Just walk. By dawn, they reached the banks of the Elbe. It was a little easier to breathe here. Thousands of refugees like them sat and lay on the cold ground, staring at the old city burning on the opposite bank. It looked like a vast refugee camp on the banks of the River Styx. It was here that the military police found them. Soldiers in helmets with gorgets on their chests were efficiently sorting the survivors, separating military from civilian, wounded from able-bodied. Seeing Klaus and the boys in their Luftwaffe uniforms, an officer approached them. "Feldwebel? What unit? Where is your battery?" Klaus looked at him with clouded eyes. The battery was destroyed. The crew. He faltered. The crew was killed. Except for the three of us. The officer nodded as if he had heard the story 100 times that morning. He wrote their names in his notebook. "You will be sent to an assembly point for servicemen. The civilians will go to an evacuation camp." And then came the moment of parting. Sister Agatha came up to Klaus. Her face was black with soot, but her eyes shone with an almost unearthly gratitude. "May God keep you, Herr Feldwebel. You and your boys. We will never forget." She couldn't finish. A little girl of about 6, whom Gerhard had been carrying, ran up to him and held out a small, grimy rag doll. The only thing she had left. Gerhard, the big, strong boy who an hour ago was breaking burning beams, took the doll, and large, dirty tears rolled down his face. The children and Sister Agatha were led away in one direction. Klaus, Kurt, and Gerhard in another. They would never see each other again. Fate scattered them as the wind scatters ash. Sister Agatha and the surviving orphans, after long ordeals in displaced persons camps, eventually found refuge in a small convent in Bavaria. She lived to a ripe old age, praying for the souls of the 5 boys she had known for only a single day until the end of her life. The fate of the surviving crew members was not so merciful. They were not court-martialed for abandoning their post. In that chaos, there was no time for tribunals. They were simply absorbed into a Volkssturm company, cobbled together from remnants of shattered units just like them. Gerhard, who always carried the little rag doll in his greatcoat pocket, was killed 2 months later in the street fighting for Berlin. A sniper's bullet went straight through his heart. Kurt survived. He was taken as a Soviet prisoner of war and spent 5 years in a logging camp. He returned to Germany in 1950. He never spoke to anyone about that night in Dresden. His wife only knew that he was afraid of thunderstorms and couldn't sleep without a light on. Nightmares of a burning city and of 2 boys falling into a fiery abyss haunted him until his death from a heart attack in 1982. Feldwebel Klaus Richter, the old soldier of 2 wars, did not live to see the end of this one. 3 weeks after the bombing of Dresden, he died in an overcrowded field hospital from pneumonia. The smoke, the ash, and the inhuman strain had finally overcome his old heart. He died quietly in his sleep, deliriously repeating the names of his boys. Kurt, Gerhard, Erich, Hans. The nurse filling out his death certificate found no identification on him, only an old dented dog tag. In the space for cause of death, she wrote, died of wounds. And so their story ended, quietly, mundanely, without notice. In the official Luftwaffe loss reports for the night of February 13th to 14th, 1945, in the Dresden center sector, a dry line was recorded. Flak position number 12 on the roof of the building at Ringstrasse 17, unresponsive, presumed destroyed by a direct hit, personnel presumed missing in action. 5 names, 1 Feldwebel and 4 air defense auxiliaries. Just a statistic. Not a word about an orphanage. Not a word about a downed mosquito. Not a word about rescued children. Their heroism, their sacrifice, their monstrous moral choice. All of it was erased, buried under the rubble of the city and covered by tons of bureaucratic paperwork. Their story never made it into the history books. No one wrote about them in the newspapers. No monuments were built for them. They simply vanished. But history, real history, doesn't live in archives. It lives in the memory of people. And it becomes legend. Among the few survivors from that Dresden neighborhood, a strange tale was told for many years. They said that on the most terrible night when the city was burning, angels were seen on the roof of the St. Magdalene orphanage. 5 angels in gray greatcoats who spewed heavenly fire from a flaming tube, protecting the children from the demons that flew in the night. It was said that as the building was collapsing, 2 of these angels, wreathed in flame, threw themselves down with their fiery sword to bar the way for evil, and the others led the children out from the very heart of the inferno. Of course, it was only a legend, a fairy tale, whispered to somehow explain the inexplicable, to believe that even in the deepest, darkest hell, there's a place for miracles and self-sacrifice. This story, passed from person to person, lost its details, became embellished with fiction, until it turned into a city myth, the myth of the nameless defenders who became guardian angels. This story is not just the chronicle of one gun crew. It is a reminder that the greatest acts of heroism are not performed on battlefields, but in the souls of ordinary people faced with an inhuman choice. It is the tale of children who were forced to become adults in a single night, and of an old man who learned at the end of his life that some things are more important than orders and a soldier's duty. Their names are forgotten, their graves are unknown, but their story, transformed into a legend, lives on, as a quiet reproach to us who live in peace, and as an eternal testament that even when the sky is burning and the earth is melting, one man, one boy, one old Feldwebel could make a choice that proves stronger than fire, stronger than steel, and stronger than death itself.